The earth shivered under the weight of a dream made of steel and gunpowder. Little David, the 914mm mortar, stood like a mechanical titan in the testing grounds of Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, its massive barrel pointed toward a sky that seemed too small to contain what was about to happen. Engineers in oil-stained coveralls wiped sweat from their brows despite the October chill of 1944, their eyes fixed on the behemoth they had conjured from blueprints and midnight calculations. No man had ever fired something like this before. The mortar's mouth gaped wide enough to swallow a grown man whole, a perfect circle of darkness that promised devastation on a scale the world had never witnessed. When the moment came, when the firing pin struck and the propellant ignited in that cavernous chamber, the sound would tear through the air like the voice of an angry god. A report so massive it would shake the soil for kilometers in every direction, rattling windows in nearby farmhouses and sending flocks of birds screaming into the distance. This was a reminder that human ambition could reach into the heavens themselves and forge weapons capable of toppling any fortress, breaking any will, inspiring terror in the hearts of any enemy foolish enough to stand before it. But the story of little David did not begin with that test firing. It began months earlier, in the smoky conference rooms of the United States Army's Ordnance Department, where men in pressed uniforms studied reconnaissance photographs of Japanese fortifications on distant Pacific islands and German bunkers buried deep in the French countryside. They saw concrete walls 5 feet thick, gun emplacements that had withstood naval bombardment and aerial assault, positions that had cost American lives by the hundreds, the thousands. Standard artillery could chip away at these structures, but the enemy had learned to build deeper, thicker, more cunningly concealed. What was needed, the planners concluded, was not just a bigger gun. It was a weapon of such overwhelming power that it could obliterate even the most hardened target with a single shot. They needed something that would make the earth itself split open, that would send shock waves through reinforced concrete until it crumbled like ancient stone, that would create a psychological impact so profound that defenders would abandon their positions at the mere rumor of its approach. The challenge landed on the desk of Samuel Feltman, a civilian engineer whose weathered hands had designed artillery pieces for 2 decades. He stood in his workshop at the Watervliet Arsenal in upstate New York, staring at the specifications that had been handed to him. 914 millimeters, 36 inches, a barrel that would fire a shell weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, a projectile so massive it would require its own transportation vehicle, the largest mortar ever conceived by American military minds. Feltman ran his fingers through his graying hair and allowed himself a moment of pure, terrified exhilaration. This was madness. This was magnificent. This was everything he had spent his life preparing to build. The weapon's ancestry traced back to an unlikely source. Little David was conceived using components originally designed for testing aerial bombs. A massive pit mortar that engineers had built to ensure that the explosives destined for B-29 bombers would function properly after being dropped from altitude. But someone, in a moment of lateral thinking that would define the project, had asked a simple question. What if we turned this testing device into a weapon? What if we mounted it on a mobile platform, designed projectiles specifically for it, and deployed it as an actual combat mortar? The conversion began in secret, another shadow project in a war that had spawned countless technological marvels from radar to the atomic bomb. Little David would be America's answer to the Schwer Gustav, the massive German railway gun that had pounded Sevastopol into submission. But where the Gustav required railroad tracks and a battalion of soldiers to operate, Little David would be, relatively speaking, mobile, deployable wherever American engineers could carve out a firing position. In the factories and workshops where Little David took shape, the scale of every component defied belief. The barrel itself measured 20 feet in length, forged from heat-treated steel that had been poured, hammered, and machined with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Workers guided overhead cranes that swung the massive tube through the air like a ship's mast, lowering it onto the recoil mechanism with hydraulic precision. The base plate, designed to distribute the weapon's tremendous recoil force into the earth, measured 6.5 feet across and weighed more than 8 tons by itself. Men welded and bolted and adjusted, their arc welders throwing cascades of sparks across the workshop floor, their hammers ringing against metal with a rhythm that sounded like church bells announcing something both sacred and terrible. The ammunition presented its own constellation of problems. Each shell was a masterpiece of destructive engineering, 36 inches in diameter and weighing 1,690 pounds when fully loaded. The high explosive filling alone contained 725 pounds of TNT, enough to level a city block. The shells required special handling equipment, custom-built dollies and hoists, because no man could lift such a projectile, and no standard military equipment could accommodate its dimensions. Engineers designed special fuses that could withstand the tremendous acceleration of being fired from a barrel, the G-forces that would crush ordinary detonators into uselessness. Each shell cost thousands of dollars to manufacture, a small fortune in an era when a factory worker might earn $30 a week. But the men in the ordnance department didn't flinch at the price tags. If one shell could destroy a bunker complex that might otherwise cost 1,000 American lives to overrun, the economics made terrible, perfect sense. The psychological dimension of the weapon obsessed the military planners as much as its physical capabilities. Major Thomas Whitmore, an artillery officer who had survived the North African campaign and seen what German 88s could do to American armor, studied intelligence reports from the Pacific Theater with growing conviction. The Japanese defenders on islands like Peleliu and Iwo Jima had proven willing to fight to the last man, hidden in cave networks and concrete bunkers that turned every yard of advance into a bloodbath. What they needed, Whitmore argued in memo after memo, was a weapon that would break the enemy's will before the infantry ever stepped onto the beach. Little David could be that weapon. Imagine, he wrote, the psychological impact of a shell that size arcing through the sky, clearly visible to defenders who would have long seconds to contemplate what was about to hit them. Imagine the explosion, the mushroom cloud of dirt and smoke rising hundreds of feet into the air, the crater left behind, 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep. Imagine watching your fortress, your invincible position, simply ceasing to exist. The Japanese called their bunkers eternal fortifications. Little David would teach them that nothing was eternal except death itself. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces fought their way across France and American forces prepared for the invasion of the Philippines, Little David was ready for its first test. The weapon had been mounted on a heavily modified M6 heavy tank chassis, though mounted hardly did justice to the engineering involved. The tank's turret had been removed, replaced by a massive rotating platform that could traverse the mortar through a limited arc. The vehicle looked like some prehistoric creature, all weight and power concentrated in that enormous barrel that jutted skyward at a 65-degree angle. It took a crew of 12 men to operate, and it required a dedicated support vehicle carrying additional shells and the complex equipment needed to prepare each round for firing. Aberdeen Proving Ground had been chosen for the test because of its isolation and because the weapons engineers there had experience with large-caliber artillery. On the morning of the first firing test, technicians swarmed over Little David like ants attending to their queen. They checked the recoil mechanism, tested the traversing gears, measured and remeasured the propellant charges that would send the massive shell on its parabolic journey downrange. Captain James Harrington, the young officer assigned to oversee the test, walked the perimeter of the firing position with mounting nervousness. He had fired 100mm howitzers, 155mm guns, even the massive 8-inch artillery pieces that had pounded German positions at Anzio. None of that had prepared him for this. The shell sitting beside the mortar on its loading cradle looked like something that had fallen from another world. Its nose cone painted bright yellow for visibility, its body stamped with serial numbers and warning labels. Harrington placed his hand on the cold steel and felt his palm tingle with anticipation. The morning light slanted through the Maryland countryside, illuminating the test range in shades of gold and green. Observation bunkers had been prepared at various distances, reinforced concrete structures with thick viewing slits where officers and engineers could watch the test without risking their lives. Seismographs had been installed to measure the ground shock. High-speed cameras had been positioned to capture every millisecond of the shell's flight and impact. Even a meteorological team had set up weather balloons and anemometers, because wind conditions at altitude would dramatically affect where a shell this size would land. Everything had been calculated, measured, prepared. Yet as the countdown began, as the crews retreated to their bunkers and the range fell silent except for the wind moving through the grass, everyone felt the same question hanging in the air. Would it work? Would the barrel hold? Would the recoil system function as designed? Or would little David tear itself apart in a catastrophic failure that would scatter steel fragments across acres of Maryland farmland? The loading process alone had taken 40 minutes. A crane positioned over the mortar had lifted the enormous shell, guided by two men with steadying ropes, and lowered it nose first into the barrel. The shell had descended slowly, inch by inch, until it came to rest on the propellant charge at the bottom of the tube. The propellant itself was modest compared to what conventional artillery used, only 54 pounds of powder to launch a ton of high explosive, because the high angle of fire meant that little David relied more on the shell's arc than on muzzle velocity. But that 54 pounds, confined in the chamber and ignited all at once, would generate pressures that made even experienced artillerymen nervous. The primer had been inserted, the firing mechanism checked and double-checked. Captain Harrington had given the order to clear the range, watched as the last technician sprinted for the safety of the bunker, and then picked up the field telephone connected to the remote firing station. "All personnel confirm safe position," he said into the handset, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his bloodstream. One by one, the observation posts checked in. The meteorology team confirmed wind conditions, 5 knots from the southwest, acceptable for the test parameters. The camera operators reported their equipment ready. The safety officer gave the final clearance. Harrington looked at Samuel Feltman, who had traveled down from Watervliet to witness the moment his creation either proved itself or failed spectacularly. The old engineer nodded once, his face pale but determined. "Fire mission," Harrington said into the telephone. "Commence firing on my mark." He took a breath, feeling the weight of all the months of work, all the resources poured into this single moment, all the hopes and fears concentrated in that massive barrel pointing at the sky. 3, 2, 1, mark. The world ended and was reborn in the same instant. The firing mechanism sent its electrical pulse to the primer, which ignited with a spark that bloomed into an inferno in the confined space of the mortar's chamber. The propellant burned not gradually but explosively, converting from solid to gas in milliseconds, expanding with such force that it drove the massive shell upward through the barrel like a cork from a champagne bottle, except this cork weighed nearly a ton and was accelerating to 300 meters per second. The sound was not a bang or a boom. Those words were inadequate. It was a physical presence, a wall of compressed air that radiated outward from the mortar in concentric waves, slamming into the observation bunkers and rattling the bones of every man watching. The ground transmitted the shock like a bell struck by a massive hammer, sending tremors through the earth that registered on seismographs 20 miles away. The muzzle blast created a fireball that expanded outward in a perfect sphere, momentarily brighter than the morning sun, followed by a massive cloud of smoke and dust that mushroomed upward, obscuring the mortar entirely. Inside the bunker, Harrington felt the concussion through his boots, through the concrete walls, through his teeth. His ears rang despite the protection he wore. Through the viewing slit, he saw the smoke clearing, saw little David still standing on its platform, the massive recoil system having absorbed the tremendous backwards force and distributed it through the steel frame and into the earth. The weapon had held. It had worked. Now came the second act of the drama, watching where the shell landed. The projectile had left the barrel at an angle of 65 degrees, climbing rapidly into the Maryland sky. The high-speed cameras captured it in silhouette against the clouds, tumbling slightly but maintaining its trajectory. At apogee, nearly 9,000 feet above the testing ground, the shell seemed to hang for an instant, a dark comma written against the sky, before gravity reasserted its dominion and pulled the massive projectile downward. It fell faster and faster, accelerating under the planet's pull, beginning to whistle as air rushed past its fins. Men in the observation posts tracked it through binoculars, watched it grow larger, watched it plummet toward the target zone that had been marked with white flags 3 miles downrange. The impact created its own apocalypse. The shell struck the earth at terminal velocity, burying itself 10 feet into the soil in the microsecond before the fuse triggered detonation. Then 725 pounds of TNT exploded simultaneously, a chemical reaction that converted solid matter into superheated gas expanding at supersonic speeds. The earth erupted upward in a dome of soil and rock that rose like a living thing, a geyser of destruction that climbed 200 feet before gravity turned it into a descending rain of debris. The shock wave rippled outward through the ground, creating concentric rings of disturbed earth that looked like ripples on a pond, except each ripple was powerful enough to knock a man off his feet at 50 yards. The sound of the impact reached the observation bunkers seconds later, a deep, visceral boom that resonated in chest cavities and made eyes water with its pressure. A mushroom cloud of brown smoke and pulverized earth rose above the impact site, climbing higher and higher until it reached 400 feet, where the wind caught it and began to tear it apart into streamers that drifted across the testing range like the banners of some ancient, defeated army. When the dust settled enough for assessment, the engineers emerged from their bunkers with clipboards and measuring tapes, approaching the crater with the reverence of pilgrims approaching a shrine. The hole in the earth measured 43 feet in diameter and 32 feet deep, a pit that could have swallowed a 3-story building. The soil at the crater's edge had been turned into glass by the heat of the explosion. Trees at the perimeter of the blast zone, 50 yards from ground zero, had been stripped of their leaves and bark, standing as white skeletons against the sky. The target, a reinforced concrete bunker built to German specifications, had simply ceased to exist. Where it had stood, there was now only a jumbled mass of concrete chunks, some weighing several tons, that had been thrown 30 feet through the air by the force of the blast. Samuel Feltman stood at the crater's edge and wept, not from sadness but from the overwhelming emotion of seeing his calculations proven correct, his design validated, his life's work vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible. This was the largest caliber artillery piece in the history of the United States Army, perhaps the largest in the world, and it functioned exactly as he had promised it would. Captain Harrington joined him at the crater's rim, both men staring into the hole as if it were a portal to another dimension. "We could end the war with this," Harrington said quietly. "One of these shells for every bunker on Iwo Jima, for every fortification on Okinawa. We could save 10,000 lives. 20,000. Feltman nodded slowly, but his expression was complex, shadowed by thoughts that went beyond simple military calculations. "Or we could turn the entire Pacific into moonscape," he said. "Every island into a wasteland of craters. Is that the world we want to create?" The question hung between them, unanswered, as the smoke continued to drift across the testing ground. In the months that followed the successful test, little David became the subject of intense planning and debate within the highest levels of military command. Intelligence reports from the Pacific indicated that the Japanese were fortifying their home islands with a fanaticism that made previous defensive preparations look half-hearted. Thousands of bunkers were being constructed, cave networks excavated, entire mountains being hollowed out to create underground fortresses. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was projected to cost 1 million American casualties, perhaps more. Little David and weapons like it, a whole battery of them, multiple guns firing in coordinated barrages, could potentially reduce those numbers significantly. Engineers began drawing up deployment plans. How to transport the massive mortars across the Pacific, how to position them on beaches or captured airfields, how to coordinate their fire with naval bombardment and aerial assault. But reality, as it often does in war, intervened in ways no planner could have anticipated. The logistical challenges of deploying Little David proved even more daunting than its engineering challenges. The weapon and its support vehicles required multiple cargo ships just to transport. Setting up a firing position meant excavating a reinforced platform, often requiring bulldozers and engineering equipment that would be desperately needed for other purposes. Each shell required its own careful handling and storage, vulnerable to enemy artillery fire or air attack during the slow, exposed process of loading and firing. The rate of fire was abysmal, one shell every 40 minutes under ideal conditions, slower under combat stress. Enemy forces would have ample time to adjust their positions, to take cover, to counterattack the exposed mortar position. More significantly, the strategic situation was evolving in ways that made super-heavy artillery increasingly obsolete. Air power was proving more flexible and devastating than the most optimistic pre-war predictions had suggested. B-29 superfortresses could deliver tons of explosives with greater accuracy and far less risk than any ground-based artillery system. The development of more powerful conventional bombs and new incendiary weapons meant that aerial bombardment could accomplish what little David was designed to do, without the massive logistical footprint. And then, in the summer of 1945, came news of a weapon so powerful that it made even little David's massive shells seem quaint. The atomic bomb. When Hiroshima vanished under a mushroom cloud that climbed miles into the stratosphere, when Nagasaki followed days later, the nature of warfare itself fundamentally changed. What use was a weapon that could destroy a single bunker when a single bomb could erase an entire city? Little David never saw combat. After the Japanese surrender in August 1945, the weapon that had been designed to crack open the gates of hell became an artifact, a curiosity, a symbol of human ingenuity pushed to its practical limits and finding those limits too confining. The mortar was eventually moved to Aberdeen Proving Grounds Ordnance Museum, where it sits today, its massive barrel still pointed skyward as if waiting for an order that will never come. Rust has claimed portions of its steel flanks. Birds nest in the gaps between its mechanical components. Children on field trips stand in its shadow and crane their necks to look up at the barrel's mouth, that perfect circle of darkness, and try to imagine the thunder it once produced. But in the memories of the men who built it, who tested it, who planned its deployment, little David remained something more than a museum piece. Samuel Feltman kept a photograph on his desk until he died in 1967. A shot taken the moment of that first firing, the massive cloud of smoke and fire erupting from the barrel, the earth beneath it buckling under forces that seemed to belong to geological processes rather than human engineering. On the back of the photograph he had written a single sentence. "We reached for the heavens and found we could shake them." Captain Harrington, who went on to serve in Korea and Vietnam, would sometimes tell younger officers about the weapon, about the sound it made, about the crater it left behind. "We thought bigger was always better," he would say. "We thought we could engineer our way to victory, build weapons so powerful that the enemy would have no choice but to surrender. And maybe we could have. But the real question we never asked was whether we should." The stories of little David filtered into legend among artillery crews, growing with each retelling. Some claimed it could have destroyed entire islands, that a single shell could have collapsed a mountain, that the Japanese high command had intelligence reports about it and had built evacuation tunnels under their fortifications specifically to escape its wrath. None of this was true, but the legends persisted because they spoke to something deeper than mere fact. The awe-inspiring, terrifying capacity of human beings to create instruments of destruction that beggared imagination. In an era that would soon produce intercontinental ballistic missiles and hydrogen bombs, little David represented a bridge between the artillery that had dominated warfare for 4 centuries and the technological apocalypse that would define the Cold War. It was the last gasp of an old way of thinking about military power, even as it embodied the new scale of destruction that modern technology made possible. Veterans who had served in the Pacific Campaign, who had fought their way across islands where every cave hid a machine gun and every ridge concealed a mortar position, sometimes wondered what might have been different if little David had been deployed. Would it have saved lives? Would it have shortened the war? Or would it simply have added another layer of devastation to a conflict that had already reduced cities to ash and nations to rubble? The questions had no definitive answers, only hypotheticals built on hypotheticals, what-ifs piled on top of might-have-beens. What remained was the weapon itself, the physical reality of it, the steel and mechanisms that proved it could be done even if it never needed to be. In the decades after the war, military historians and weapons enthusiasts would occasionally rediscover little David, writing articles about it in specialized journals, including it in encyclopedias of unusual weapons, producing documentaries that featured dramatic recreations of its test firing. Each generation seemed to find new significance in it. In the 1960s, during the height of the Cold War, it became a symbol of American ingenuity and industrial might. In the 1980s, as precision-guided munitions began to dominate military thinking, it represented the crude but effective approach of an earlier era. In the early 21st century, as debates about military spending and technological overkill intensified, little David became a cautionary tale about the limits of brute force, a reminder that bigger isn't always better, that the most powerful weapon is useless if it can't be effectively deployed. The engineers who designed it, the workers who built it, the soldiers who tested it. Most of them are gone now, their memories dissolved into the past like smoke from a fired shell. But the weapon they created endures, a monument to a moment in history when it seemed that any problem could be solved with enough steel and explosives, when the laws of physics were challenges to be overcome rather than limits to be respected, when human ambition and human folly walked hand in hand down the testing grounds of Maryland and showed the world what could be achieved when ingenuity was married to destruction. On quiet days at Aberdeen Proving Ground, when the wind moves through the Ordnance Museum and the sun illuminates little David's massive barrel, it's possible to imagine the ghost of that test firing, the thunder rolling across the decades, the ground shaking with sympathetic memory. The mortar stands as a question mark written in steel, asking each generation whether the power to destroy is the same as the wisdom to know when not to use it. It speaks of an era when warfare was transforming from the industrial to the atomic age, when the technologies that would define the second half of the 20th century were emerging from workshops and laboratories, when men with slide rules and welding torches could create weapons that rivaled natural disasters in their destructive potential. The crater from that first test firing remained visible for years afterward, a scar on the landscape that slowly filled with rainwater and became colonized by weeds and small trees, nature reclaiming what had been temporarily obliterated. Eventually the crater was filled in, the land returned to use for other testing purposes, but photographs of it survived in military archives and personal collections. Those images became talismans for the men who had witnessed the test, proof that they had stood on the edge of something extraordinary, that they had helped push the boundaries of what was possible even if what was possible turned out not to be necessary. In the broader sweep of World War II history, little David occupies a footnote, a curiosity, an interesting detail that changed nothing about the war's ultimate outcome. But in the narrower history of military technology, of human engineering pushed to extremes, it stands as a monument to a particular kind of thinking that defined the mid-20th century. The belief that there was no problem that couldn't be solved by building something bigger, no fortress that couldn't be cracked by firing something heavier, no limit to what could be achieved if enough resources and intelligence were devoted to the task. That belief produced the atomic bomb and the Saturn V rocket, radar and computers and jet engines. It also produced weapons like Little David, tools of such overwhelming power that they made their own deployment almost impossible. The mortar story is ultimately a human story, the tale of men trying to master the physics of destruction, trying to create instruments that would save lives by taking them more efficiently, trying to impose order on the chaos of war through the application of engineering principles and mathematical precision. They succeeded magnificently in building what they set out to build. The weapon worked exactly as designed. But working as designed and being useful proved to be two different things, and in that gap between theoretical capability and practical application lies a lesson that echoes across the decades. That the things we can build are not always the things we should build, that power without purpose is merely spectacle, that the greatest weapons are ultimately no substitute for wisdom. Little David remains at Aberdeen, its barrel still angled toward the sky, still waiting in its eternal silence for a call to action that will never come. It stands as testament to the ingenuity of its creators, the ambition of its sponsors, the terror it might have inspired, and the restraint, accidental or otherwise, that kept it from ever being used in anger. In its shadow, visitors from around the world stand and take photographs, marveling at the scale of it, trying to imagine the sound it made when it spoke its single word of thunder into the Maryland morning, trying to comprehend what kind of mind could envision such a thing and what kind of age could bring it into being. The earth remembers, even if we forget. Somewhere in the soil of Aberdeen Proving Ground, beneath decades of growth and change, the molecular structure of the Earth still bears the imprint of that test firing, the compression and displacement of matter under forces that briefly rivaled geological processes. Somewhere in the archives, the seismograph traces remain, those jagged lines recording the moment when human engineering made the planet itself shudder. And somewhere in the fading memories of aging veterans and the careful records of military historians, the story persists, of the largest mortar ever built by American hands, of the weapon that could have changed the Pacific War but never got the chance, of Little David and its thunder that shook the world once and then fell silent forever, leaving behind only questions about the nature of power and the wisdom of those who wield it.